We now move on to questions to the Minister of Justice. Questions 2 and 7 have been withdrawn, and I call Joanne Bunting.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Question 1, please.
I call the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 1 and 10 together. At the outset, I wish to explain that the recruitment of police officers is an operational matter for the Chief Constable. He is accountable to the Northern Ireland Policing Board, and I am committed to respecting his operational independence and the role of the Board. In my recent letter to executive colleagues, I had advised that the Chief Constable has decided on a precautionary basis to defer the March 2022 recruitment intake. This decision is based on the assessment made of the impact of the draft budget for PSNI. This is one of many steps which will need to be taken to live within the draft Department of Justice budget settlement, of which the PSNI is the largest part. PSNI has indicated that in order to proceed with the March intake, it would incur between 4 and 5 million of fixed costs for 2022-23 and beyond. In the context of a draft budget which requires major reductions in spending, the PSNI has concluded it would be best to defer this intake and review the situation once the final budget is set. I have made it very clear to the Finance Minister and the Executive that the draft 2022-25 budget would be incredibly damaging and create major challenges, not just for policing but for the entire justice system. However, I would still strongly encourage anyone with concerns on the impact of the draft budget on policing to have their say before the consultation period closes on the 7th of March.
Supplementary, Joanne Bunting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware that increasing police numbers was a key component of the NDNA and one aspect of that agreement that will benefit everybody in society. And I appreciate the Minister may consider it an operational issue, but we all know that if political will is there, the money can be found. So could I ask her what bid she has, if she would outline what bid she has made and what representation she has made to the Minister of Finance to ensure we do not regress to impractical numbers of police officers, which will see a vast reduction in service?
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, it should be recognised that we lobbied hard last year to ensure that the additional funding for an additional 100 officers to meet the NDNA requirement would be made available. However, as I've explained, the Chief Constable is now not going to recruit the additional 85 of that cohort for the reasons I've already set out. I have raised my concerns consistently with the Minister of Finance from the first iteration of this draft budget until quite recently. He is well aware of my views. I have made them known at Executive and I have made them known in writing to the Department of Finance. My officials continue to engage with the Department of Finance. The Minister for Finance has indicated that he is continuing to engage with Treasury to see whether or not additional flexibilities for the police will be found. That does not resolve the fundamental problem, which is that the Department of Justice faces an unprecedented challenge in terms of its budget, having essentially absorbed 9% cuts since devolution, now to be faced with another 2% cut, and in practice the worst budget settlement of any of the 9 departments, as indicated by the Independent Fiscal Council.
Call Ciara Ferguson. Sorry, I call Alex Eason.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Minister for her answer so far. Minister, at a time where the police are undermanned, under-resourced and morale at an all-time low, is it not up to you to find the money to find police recruitment so that we can tackle law and order issues across Northern Ireland?
Well, I'm not sure exactly where the member thinks that I will find the money. It's not as though we keep the budget down the back of my sofa in the department. Ultimately, for me to be able to find the money requires the Executive to decide to prioritise these issues in the budget for the next 3 years. So there is an onus on me to make my views clear and to make the case strongly. I have done that. I have done it with the Policing Board and I have made clear to them my concerns. I have made clear to other parts of the justice system. But I cannot magic up the money. If the Executive does not prioritise justice, then we will have to live within our budget, as will every other department when that is set. So whilst there is an onus on me to make the case, I'm afraid there is no way that I, as an individual minister, can make money available that hasn't been allocated by the Department of Finance.
I call Ciara Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister, thus far for your update. Obviously, you mentioned the operational independence, but can you confirm to us today if you have received a business case from the PSNI setting out how they aim to meet their shortfall over the next few years?
Well, we are continuing to work with all of our colleagues. At the moment, their priority has been to look, first of all, to their own budgets. Their operational business cases would first go through the Policing Board as opposed to coming directly to our department. It is only where they're seeking additional funding for particular measures that it would come to our department and to the Department of Finance for approval. That is not the case. This is a matter of them managing within the resource that's allocated by the Department of Finance. They are, of course, keeping us abreast of some of the challenges that will face them, and I think that this is indicative of one of the particular challenges that they will have, because whilst money has been set aside to deal with the extra 100 officers, so the money that the Department of Finance allocated for an additional 100 officers is still available. The underlying budget, so the baseline budget for the PSNI, will reduce, with the result that we may have an additional new 100 officers, but the existing complement will drop. And it's not just by the 85 that has been indicated. The PSNI have indicated that there could be a significant reduction in the numbers of officers. It needs to be recognised that much of what happens in justice is very heavily dependent on personnel. And therefore, when you have 68% of your budget to the PSNI and the lion's share of that budget going on salaries, when you take 2% out of that budget, there is no alternative but to look at where numbers can be reduced.
Rose Kelly.
Speaker, Minister, can you give us an update on the pay award claim from PSNI officers?
All of the matters that have been brought to me in terms of being cleared for pay award have been cleared. We're still, I think, waiting for receipt of some of the papers from the PSNI themselves, but I can update the member in writing just to give her the most up-to-date view as of today.
Paul McNesbitt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I declare an interest as a member of the Policing Board. The draft budget does not just impact on headcount. Grateful if the Minister could update the House on discussions between her department and the PSNI with regard to what they're calling their campus, which would embrace the new policing college, new headquarters, crime and logistics branches.
Well, we continue to engage with PSNI. Their plans for a campus is still at a relatively early stage, and the member will be aware from his engagement at the Policing Board that that is the case. The first stage will be for them to get the support of the Policing Board for those plans, and then to come back to seek capital investment. The difficulty, of course, and the member will recognise this, is that it isn't just about the resource budget, which is by far the biggest challenge that we face, in that the capital budget is slightly more generous. The real challenge is that in order to deliver on the capital budget, you need human resources to do that. And so unless you actually have the resource funding to be able to make those changes, capital expenditure can also be constrained. And so we will be working very carefully with the PSNI in order to realise their vision of a more modern and appropriate form of campus for the future. But it will, of course, be constrained by budgetary pressures. We will make the case as strongly as we can, as I am sure the Policing Board will assist us in doing, and indeed the Chief Constable himself.
John Blair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I should say also as a member of the Policing Board, Mr. Speaker, that those of us who serve on that Policing Board have had a fairly stark picture painted to us reflecting this issue and the problems around it. And the Minister herself has previously mentioned consequences from the proposed budget settlement for the entire justice system, including that goes beyond policing. Could she outline her main concerns on this issue?
Well, my concerns, Mr. Speaker, I think are well rehearsed. At the moment, we would see a fall of 2% in the department's budget. Unlike other departments, there is not significant add-in from other government sources, with the result that we actually do face a significant challenge going forward. That will make it very difficult for us to be able to manage court recovery in the context of COVID. It will also, I think, make it incredibly difficult for prison service in terms of the resources available to them to do their job. We have a number of statutory functions that are not easily avoided, and therefore there are inescapable pressures before we even look to do, I suppose, the positive things that we wish to do as a department. Those statutory functions need to be met, and there is a question mark as to whether or not we will have a sufficient resource to fully meet all of our statutory duties under the current budget settlement. So to say that it is a serious issue, I think, is not to exaggerate the challenge. Mr. Speaker, also to put on record that I do this as Justice Minister now, but it will be potentially a new Justice Minister who will have to face into this. So this is not about a minister trying to protect their own silo. I am concerned about the impact that this will have on the justice system and whomever might end up standing at this dispatch box in years to come. I hope that they will have the opportunity to be able to make progress in justice rather than simply stand here to announce a series of cuts and reversals in good progress that has been made to date.
I call Philip McGuigan.
Case number 3, question 3.
As I said to the member in my answer to him on the 20th of January, I find the findings within the report extremely distressing. I would also like to acknowledge the pain felt by bereaved families and injured victims. For me, the report again highlights the need for implementation of a comprehensive approach to dealing with the legacy of the past, and I believe the Stormont House Agreement, while not perfect, remains the best model for doing so at present. Parties have rightly expressed their opposition to the UK Government's proposals with regard to legacy, and I would urge everyone to continue to challenge those proposals and to help ensure that victims and their families have access to justice. To do otherwise only compounds their suffering. The report also reminds us of the significant reforms of policing which have taken place, which include robust oversight arrangements supported by all the main parties. I note at the time the report was released the comments of the Deputy Chief Constable, who acknowledged the hurt and anger that will be felt by families, and I welcomed his apology to them for the findings of the report. He also recognised, as do I, the significant reforms of policing which have taken place since these terrible events occurred. It is primarily a matter for the Chief Constable, who is operationally independent of the Department and accountable to the Policing Board, to decide what actions might be necessary following the publication of the report by the Ombudsman, and it would not be appropriate for me to comment on any matter that may be the subject of a police investigation. I will again repeat my call for anyone who has evidence in regard to these crimes to come forward and assist the PSNI with any future inquiries.
Supplementary, Philip McGuigan.
Minister, it's clear from reading the Police Ombudsman report that it demonstrates collusion between state agencies and loyalist death squads, collusion that resulted in a campaign of murder that went unchecked across North Antrim, County Derry and beyond. Person K, alluded to in this report, was a key suspect in the murders of Jared Casey, Councillor Eddie Fullerton, Thomas Donaghy, Danny Cassidy, Malik Ikiri, and in the Castle Rock and Greysteel massacres. Does the Minister agree with me, given that this covers at least 17 murders and substantial evidence in this report pointing to Person K being a mass murder on behalf of the British state, does she believe that Person K should be brought to justice?
Mr Speaker, I note what the Ombudsman, after a thorough investigation, has said about collusive behaviours, and I accept her findings. Where evidence is identified of criminal behaviour by police officers, that should, of course, be investigated. I acknowledge that the investigation found no evidence that the RUC had prior knowledge of the attacks. The report recognises also that police investigations into the attacks were prompt and thorough, resulting in a number of convictions. With respect to the role of members of the UDR outlined in the report, that would be a matter for the MOD to take forward and comment upon. But I am clear that where there is any suggestion that people have broken the law, it should be fully investigated.
You call Mervyn Sorley.
Mr Speaker, I think it becomes the party opposite to be crying about the issue of bringing people to justice for murder, given the fact that they supported murder in Northern Ireland for 40 years.
Member needs to get their question.
Would the Minister also raise with me or assure me that the issue of collusive behaviour, which has no legal basis but continues to be a phrase that is used, and unless there is evidence, we cannot continue to besmirch the memory of the RUC that served faithfully the people of Northern Ireland and wasn't a terrorist organisation?
Well, Mr Speaker, the issue of the use of the phrase collusive behaviour was set out by a judge in their determination that the Ombudsman was not in a position to be able to determine whether collusion had taken place, but was in a position to determine whether collusive behaviours had taken place. And as I said when I answered the previous member, the Ombudsman's office did a thorough investigation. The Ombudsman has said that there were collusive behaviours, and I accept her findings. However, I have also recognised that she also found no evidence that the RUC had prior knowledge of the attacks, and that she recognised that police investigations into the attacks were prompt and thorough. There are a number of findings in this report that are very shocking and concerning. But it is important to recognise that at the same time as those collusive behaviours were substantiated by the Ombudsman's Office, there were those who were working hard in order to try to protect the community against all paramilitary activity.
Call Chris Little.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister for Justice agree that the UK Government's legacy proposals represent a retrograde step on Stormont House, and that a comprehensive mechanism is going to be necessary for justice, information recovery and reconciliation to be delivered for all in Northern Ireland?
I absolutely agree with the member for East Belfast. I think it is hugely important that there is a proper investigation in order to ensure that families can have confidence in the current justice system, because what the government proposes is denying people justice. All of us know that with the passage of time, the degradation of memory, and all of the other challenges that families have faced over many years, being able to successfully pursue a case in court to prosecution would be incredibly difficult in many, if not all, of these cases. However, that is a different assessment from one that says you may not pursue a case where the evidence is available for you to do so. I believe that intervention is a damaging one in terms of justice and in terms of people's confidence in the current justice system. I have been clear with the Secretary of State and with the Government that I believe it would be wrong to do so. I think we have to accept due process. And yes, it can be long and frustrating, but at least it gives families the reassurance that their concerns are taken seriously, and it gives the rest of us in society who are not directly victims of these cases the confidence to know that if something equally as awful were to happen to us, there would be due process in our cases too. The Ombudsman's Office and many of the parts of the justice system that are currently dealing with legacy issues were never designed for that purpose, nor in the next budget settlement is there the kind of resource that would be required for them to continue to shoulder this burden. I therefore agree entirely that the UK Government needs to progress a comprehensive strategy for dealing with these issues that does not disrupt due process.
Mark Durgan.
And to thank the Minister for her answers thus far. Does the Minister support the findings of the report whereby it was found that families' concerns about collusive activity are legitimate and justified? If so, can the Minister outline or at least suggest next steps for these families who have suffered for so long?
Well, as I have said already, Mr. Speaker, I accept the findings of the Ombudsman's report. It was a thorough investigation and she has made her views known about collusive behaviour. I don't think that any of us at a human level would doubt that that would cause huge concern and distress to families. The Assistant Chief Constable, the Deputy Chief Constable, has apologised for what happened during that period, and I think it was right that they should do so. As for next steps at this stage, some of these cases may well end up before the courts, and therefore it would not be appropriate for me to say what those next steps should look like. But I'm clear that there should be a thorough investigation where there is the opportunity still to find those who are responsible guilty in a court of law, and I would encourage anyone with information that would assist the police in such inquiry to be able to come forward and share that information.
I call Robin Newton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 4.
The Director-General is content that the current operational staffing complement in the Northern Ireland Prison Service is sufficient to safely and effectively manage each of our prisons. However, staffing levels, that is the number of staff available for duty on a daily basis, have understandably been under pressure in recent months due to high levels of staff COVID absences. Northern Ireland Prison Service is committed to an ongoing process of recruitment to ensure that staffing levels are consistently maintained through the appointment and training of new staff. Under the most recent recruitment campaigns, 162 staff joined Northern Ireland Prison Service at the latest recruitment campaign, which concluded on the the 31st of January, is planned to recruit a further 120 officers over the next 2 years, subject to budget being available. However, as members will appreciate, growing uncertainty regarding the budget for next year has made any realistic planning all the more difficult for our frontline services, including the prison service. In response to COVID-19, Northern Ireland Prison Service headquarters and the governor of each prison establishment have been reviewing the availability of staff each day. Governors and their teams have been able to dynamically adjust the regime that can be delivered for people in our care, focusing on safe, decent and secure custody. In real terms, this has meant the prisons are rightly focused on ensuring that healthy regimes can be offered on landings and that prisoners do not spend lengthy periods locked in cell. This means refocusing some staff from peripheral to core functions in the short term. I think it is to the credit of Northern Ireland Prison Service governors and staff that despite the impact on staffing availability in all sectors as a result of COVID-19, Northern Ireland Prison Services continue to deliver safe and predictable regimes to people in our care.
Supplementary, Robin Newton.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answers so far. Minister, 2 weeks ago the Youth Justice Agency came before the Justice Committee to give oral evidence, and last week the Probation Board came before the Justice Committee to give oral evidence. Both organisations expressed concerns around the draft budget, indicating in fact that that may indeed mean staff reductions in both cases. Can I ask the Minister, what will be the implications for the prison service if the Finance Minister were to, and if I use this topical phrase, rigorously implement his draft budget?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think I have been clear that all parts of the justice system will come under considerable pressure, and none more so than those which are incredibly reliant on the availability of suitably skilled and trained personnel, and that applies clearly to prison service. The issue is about how we ensure that we can maintain our safe custody, but also that we can hold people in what is a dignified manner and allowing them the opportunities for rehabilitation. My primary concern with prisons is less around the safety of the institutions and more around the ability of us to be able to facilitate, for example, free association out of cell, meaningful purpose and work and activity, and also the opportunities that prison officers offer on a daily basis to support people with their particular needs and also challenge for rehabilitation. I think all of those could be impacted by a significant reduction in the budget. Members will also be aware that we have plans for significant capital investment in prisons, and that, of course, too requires resource in order to be able to do it. To put it in context, Mr. Speaker, at the moment we have people still in isolation when they're committed to our prisons. We have been able to, by and large, maintain most people not having to double up in their cells, though we have had to have some doubling up because of rising numbers. We have been able to ensure that there is free association each day for prisoners on their landing, and that we have been able to reintroduce, for example, the normal education with our outside providers during this period of COVID. That has been incredibly resource intensive, and no one should underestimate the cost of that in terms of being able to maintain it going forward. I don't want to see anything that is going to limit that flexibility that we have within the prisons or the quality of the provision that we make for those who are held in our care. But again, we will have to live within whatever resources are allocated by the Northern Ireland Executive.
Minister, the safe and effective running of the prison system we know is about so much more than just housing prisoners, and you've alluded to effective measures around rehabilitation and reducing reoffending. I know you've said that could be impacted as a result of future budgets, but can the Minister outline whether the current prison staffing levels is allowing this really crucial work to take place now?
At the moment, the current staffing levels allow it to take place, but it is not taking place in the way that it had been before, so there are still restrictions in place in our prisons as a result of COVID. So, for example, some things that may have happened in the past in terms of managing post and packages has had to be restricted in order to ensure that officers, it's a very intensive, resource intensive and personnel intensive operation. So to ensure that officers are available to be able to support prisoners in their cell and in their landing and with their rehabilitation, some of the processes there will have slowed down during COVID to allow for that. We have, as I say, tried where COVID restrictions have been relaxed in the community outside to reflect that inside, so by reintroducing, for example, in-person visits and trying to expand those to include particularly children. We've also maintained our commitment to virtual visits, but again, all of those are very resource intensive, and were at the beginning of the pandemic, when we didn't have people attending court, we could use some of our PACS officers to be able to come in and provide some extra support within prisons. With our court system now running at full capacity, it's very difficult for us to get that balance. But the governors are consistent that what they have been able to offer prisoners is a predictable regime. We are still doing their training and so on in the prisons, which is important. And I know, having visited Hyde Bank Wood, for example, and spoken to some of the young people in the college there, it's incredibly important to them, whether it's remote learning or in-person learning, that they are able to proceed with their courses, get their certificates and move on, because that's a crucial part of their rehabilitation and their strategy for when they leave prison to find work. So we are doing all of those things, but we're having to do them in different ways and often much more resource-intensive ways in order to manage the demands of COVID.
Councillor Bradley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for your answers so far. Minister, across the Justice family and the prison service, there have been many red flags raised with us at Justice Committee, and projected red flags with the 2% cut that is outlined for the Department of Justice. All of these uncertainties are making people very nervous, and I would ask the Minister, could she spell out to us what the absence of an executive would mean in her trying to deliberate on these issues?
Well, as the member will be aware, without an executive, a budget cannot actually be set. However, I have, of course, sought advice as to what would happen in terms of future spend, were that situation to extend beyond the new financial year and into the next financial year, which it now looks likely to do. It will, of course, make things very uncertain, because we will be back to the situation where departments can only spend a particular percentage of their budget. Though, of course, there will still be ministers in place in this situation, potentially for at least part of that time, which eases some of the pressure. However, what I have been trying to determine, and it remains unclear, is the weight that would be given to the draft budget in terms of the settlement that would be agreed for departmental spending. Whilst it hasn't been agreed by the Executive, and indeed wasn't cleared by the Executive in terms of content before going to consultation, it may nevertheless carry weight in terms of the allocation to departments in future years. So even if the Executive incoming agreed a different budget, in the interim we may have to live within the draft budget rather than go back to, for example, last year's allocation, which may have been a more favourable one, certainly in terms of justice. But it does, I think, highlight a wider point, and that is that in order for us to be able to do business, certainty is required. Many of the things that we do within justice, and I know the member is very aware of this given her involvement with the committee, involve us working with third sector partners who are very reliant on contracts from the Department of Justice. And so when these things become protracted and uncertain, so do our partners in terms of their stability and in terms of being able to retain people with the right skill set and abilities and experience to be able to deliver at the optimum level for those in the justice system. So it is an incredibly difficult position to be in. It is never a good thing not to have an executive, and it is a very uncertain time when we have no budget to not have one in place to make those decisions.
They call Colin Gilder.
Minister, question number 5. Thank you.
In my statement to the House last week, I explained the challenges faced by the Northern Ireland Prison Service and its staff as they seek to manage and rehabilitate people who have very complex and difficult behaviours and needs. At that time, I also expressed my determination, shared by the Prison Service, to apply the learning and address the recommendations from the recently published review of care and supervision units. CSUs are necessary because at times prisoners cannot be managed safely elsewhere in the prison estate. This may be because they are violent to other prisoners and staff, they repeatedly damage property, they are determined to traffic drugs, or because they exhibit behaviours that are extreme and would put themselves and others in custody at risk. Sometimes it can be because of a combination of those factors. The safety of everyone who lives and works within our prisons must be considered, and sometimes that means that a decision is taken to relocate someone to the CSU. Those decisions are often finely balanced between the complex needs of an individual and the safety and well-being of everyone who lives and works in that residential landing. The majority of people who are relocated to the CSU are there for a short period of time before being relocated back to their usual accommodation. For others, a longer stay in CSU is needed, depending on the circumstances of each case. Over the last 3 years, the number of prisoners who were placed in CSU for for more than 10 days is as follows. In 2019, 209 prisoners. In 2020, 187 prisoners. And in 2021, 156 prisoners. I'm encouraged that this data shows that fewer individuals are being held for more than 10 days and hope that implementing the recent recommendations of the report will lead to further reductions.
And that ends the period for a list of questions, members. And we now move on to 15 minutes of topical questions. I call Trevor Lunn.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Minister, what are the implications of not having an executive in place over the coming weeks in terms of her department's legislative programme?
Mr. Speaker, I remain on target to complete the Assembly passage of the 2 remaining bills in the Department of Justice's primary legislation programme, subject to this mandate running to completion. Further consideration stage of the Protection from Stalking Bill was held earlier today, and final stage is provisionally scheduled for week commencing the 21st of February. Though I may speak to the Speaker to explore the possibility of bringing the date forward in line with some of the discussions that have been ongoing. I have some concerns that the Justice Sexual Offences and Trafficking Victims Bill is potentially vulnerable if there are flawed amendments, which I would find it difficult to correct in the current circumstances, or to the Assembly rising in the event of an early election. Consideration stage of that bill is scheduled for the 15th of February. I've already secured executive agreement to bring forward a small number of necessary amendments that introduce new policy content, but in the absence of an executive from this point forward, I will not be able to bring forward any departmental amendments to correct future amendments that are either defective or impractical. Worst case scenario would be that if an amendment represents bad or unworkable law, my only option then would be to withdraw such a bill. That's not an option that I would want to exercise, given the important provisions of the bill and the important impact that it makes on vulnerable victims. Mr. Speaker, secondary legislation, legislative consent motions and many of the other things which we would wish to do over the next period, of course, will also be impacted in order for us to bring them to this chamber, particularly where they're cross-cutting or where it's a legislative consent motion. We do need, first of all, to have executive approval. I've already sought executive approval for a number of LCMs. However, there are a number of others that may emerge over the coming weeks, for which we will simply have to wait to the next mandate. It is clearly also an issue of concern, as I've already stated, that we do not have a budget for next year.
Supplementary, Trevor Lunn.
I thank the Minister for her answer. She rightly highlights the situation around the Justice Sexual Offences and People Trafficking Bill, which is vitally important, and every effort should be made to finalise that in this mandate. Would the Minister agree with me that the worst outcome of the current shenanigans would be that we have an early election? She's already referred to it, but just put on the record what that would mean.
Well, I believe that the executive should be in place and that we should use all that remains of this mandate to deliver for the people of Northern Ireland. We lost 3 years already in this mandate due to suspension. We need no more shilly-shallying around that could cost the public these opportunities that we have to deliver for them now. It is my intention, in as far as it lies to me, to wring every possible benefit out of these last number of weeks for the people I represent. And I think it's incumbent of all of us to ensure that we complete this mandate, that we deliver what we promised, and that we go to the election on that basis, so we're judged on what we have done rather than what we have not done.
I call Doug Beattie.
Speaker, Minister, could you give us an update on the appointment of a Victims of Crime Commissioner?
I can give a very quick update on the Victims of Crime Commissioner. I have agreed an individual to be approached, to be asked to be the Victims of Crime Commissioner. We now await their response, and I will update the House and the committee further once this is settled.
Supplementary, Doug Beattie.
Thank you, Minister. And fair enough. Can I just confirm with you, because there's an awful lot of time and effort been expended in regards to this particular issue, that it will not be derailed by the fact that we do not have an executive Deputy First Minister?
Will not be derailed by that, Mr. Speaker. In all likelihood, having indicated my preferred candidate from the rigorous interview process that took place, and having taken that forward with executive approval, that should be able to continue on. The biggest challenge, in fact, for the Victims of Crime Commissioner, again, touches on budget, because there are additional costs. At one stage, people wanted both a domestic abuse commissioner and a hate crime commissioner. And when I said that we couldn't afford to do that, people rolled their eyes and thought that I was being dramatic. However, I have to say that it has been somewhat of a challenge to continue with this particular issue in the light of the budget settlement that we have ahead. However, I've made a commitment that this is something that I believe is important and vital, in fact, to victims, and I think we need to prioritise it as a department, irrespective of the budget settlement.
You call Aisling Riley.
Minister, the recent CGI&I report exposed serious failings regarding the operation of care and supervision units and the treatment of prisoners with severe mental disorders and complex needs. In light of this, will the Minister provide an update on mental health court?
Well, I have, as you're aware, written to the Minister of Health, seeking an urgent meeting with him to discuss how we deal with those who have mental health issues. As I said at the time, there is currently no one in our CSUs awaiting a transfer direction order. The difficulty, of course, is that many people who have significant mental health issues do not meet the very high threshold that requires them to be transferred to a mental health facility. The vast majority of people, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's important that we put this on record, the vast majority of people who have mild, moderate or even serious mental health issues within our prison are managed effectively in the main prison population. CSUs are not routinely used to hold those with mild, moderate or even severe mental health issues. It is only used when those particular prisoners are not able to be managed on an exceptional basis for whatever reason within the main population. But it isn't a routine of the department and of prison service to place people who have mental health issues in CSU. To put in context, only around 1% or less of the prison population are in the CSU, when we know that well over 35% of those in prisons have serious mental health issues.
Supplementary, Aisling Riley.
Minister, the idea of a mental health court was first recommended over a decade ago, so we need to see a wee bit of progress around that. And can you indicate if you have committed any resources in terms of staff and funding to carry out a scope and review?
They've already had a recommendation, but it's very clear that in a population the size of Northern Ireland, as I set out quite clearly last week, there is absolutely no scope for a mental health prison. That just will not work. I mean, at the moment, for example, we only have one person held in CSU who is there because of behavioural issues. And that individual, the rest are there because they have committed offences, whether that's violent offences or drug smuggling, suspect of drug smuggling, not because of their mental health. There's only one person who is there because of their behavioural issues, and those behavioural issues, that person has already been assessed, and their behavioural issues are not sufficient to require them to be transferred to a secure mental health facility. I think that the solution, the landing zone for this, is to ensure that people within the prison system receive the same access to mental health care as anyone outside the prison system. So perhaps it is possible, working with the Department of Health, to provide some access to beds within a secure mental health facility. But it will never be a mental health prison of the kind, for example, of Broadmoor, because 9 times out of 10 that facility would need to be serviced, would need to be resourced, but would stand empty.
Call down Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Could the Minister indicate to the House what percentage of prisoners are currently, of the prison population, are currently on remand?
Yes, I can, and I think I could summarise it by saying too many for our liking. But if the member will bear with me a second, I actually have some figures that I can hopefully share with her. There is an issue in terms of remand and the numbers that we have. I think around 35% of our prisoners are currently on remand. But if the member will bear with me, I actually have some figures which I would like to present because I think they're important. On the 31st of January, the percentage of the overall Northern Ireland prison population on remand was 38%. So that is 608 of the 1,600 individuals currently in our care. Looking specifically at the female population, 58.3% of the 72 women in our care were on remand on that date. Comparative figures for England and Wales, Scotland and the Republic of Ireland are 16.2%, 26.6% and 21.5% respectively.
Supplementary, Diane Dodds.
I think the House will be extremely interested in those figures and will register shock that 38% of the prison population that is on remand, of the prison population are prisoners currently on remand, and 58% of women who are in prison are currently on remand. Surely that is an unacceptable figure, and would the Minister indicate what she is doing to actually remedy this? And in doing so, and having expressed her concerns on numerous times in this House today, indicate why she did not just vote against the Sinn Féin budget as proposed?
Well, the member is aware that discussing votes in executive is not really appropriate, and she will have known that from her time as a minister. But there was no motion put to the executive to vote against. I made it very clear, and it is minuted in the executive minutes, that I did not support the budget. But there was no motion brought to executive that would have permitted the vote. I have to say, Mr Speaker, that my focus was on ensuring that the public had their say, because I think it's important that all of those who will be affected by the budget are able to feed into it. And so rather than hold the budget up with another squabble in executive, I think we all agreed, including her own colleagues, that whilst we didn't agree the content of the budget, we were happy that the budget would be put out for consultation. In terms of what we're seeing with remand, which was the main part of the question, there has been a continual rise in the remand population over the last 4 years. So it's risen from about 25% in 17-18 to what we have at the moment, which is significantly higher, and as she rightly says, in my view, unacceptable. It is a complex issue, however. We do not make the decision whether or not someone will be remanded in custody. That is a matter for the presiding judge. So we can't control the number of people in remand. We can, of course, do work to try to speed up justice, and we've been investing very heavily in speeding up justice at the Criminal Justice Board, and also in terms of the Committal Reform Bill, which very helpfully the committee were able to ensure made it through its passage in this mandate, all of which will help to speed things up. The Department undertook a review of the remand population in 2019. There were no clear underlying factors which explain the increase, but it is an accumulation, we suspect, of minor challenges. First of all, there are issues with the prison service and so on. So we have a working group now with the Director General of Prison Service to consider the options available. We are also looking particularly, and indeed I have asked for a meeting with Minister Hargey around housing, because one of the reasons why people are often...
2 minutes is up.
I realise, Mr Speaker, it was a compound question, but this is, if you would bear with me for 2 seconds. We are also looking at the opportunity for extending GPS monitoring beyond simply present and not present at home, to actually monitor where people are, because that may provide more security in terms of judges being willing to release people on bail as opposed to remand. But it isn't always, as I say, in our gift, but having suitable accommodation is a key factor.
Call Keith Buchanan.
Minister, this part of the United Kingdom watched with interest and still do reference the ongoings in Number 10 regarding parties, etc., where a few dozen dressed up in fancy attire, which you were very vocal on. With regards to another party, namely Sinn Féin, as Justice Minister, whom the man and woman on the street expect you to be, was justice carried out with respect to the Bobby Sturry funeral, where thousands dressed up in fancy attire? Were you as vocal?
Mr Speaker, I think anybody who was in this chamber who was genuinely interested in that issue will recall that I was particularly vocal on the issue. I believe that those of us who set the rules must keep the rules. I think that applies whether it's in this chamber, whether it's rules set by, for example, the national government when they do their negotiations with international bodies and set rules, that we abide by those laws too. And I think it also applies to COVID regulations when it comes to this House. I'm surprised the member needs to ask, because I think I've been fairly clear on this and consistent throughout.
Less than a minute left, Keith Buchanan.
Thank you, Minister, for your very good answer. But my question back to you is, you called for the Prime Minister to go. Did you ask for the Deputy First Minister to go?
I did, and if the member cares to read any of the news reports at the time, it's clearly identified. I'll not assume the member reads the newsletter, but it was recorded there. It's also recorded in the Belfast Telegraph, and there are numerous other reports, and we haven't done so. I do think, Mr Speaker, it is a bit of a waste of time in this House if people are going to refer to issues that happened a year and a half ago without doing the research before they arrive.
And members' time is up. Members, please take your ease for a moment or two before we move on to the next item on the order paper. Thank you.